thought I would say something about zooming out because of the time of year. Last weekend, I just happened to be jumping in our pond for one of the last swims of the summer probably, and I was doing my breaststroke across this completely flat surface, and I just noticing that the water is now starting to get a little colder. In about 3 or 4 weeks, it'll be really very cold when you get in there, and you just kind of know the seasons are changing, and sometimes it's a good time to just zoom out and think about our lives. And so I've picked a passage thinking about wisdom that comes from King Solomon, who is known or famous for his wisdom. And this is what it says: when the Queen of Sheba, who was at the time the reigning monarch in the Middle East, when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon, she came to test him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very large retinue, camels bearing spices, a great deal of gold, precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And she said to the king, "Report is true that I have heard in my own land," which is, by the way, Yemen, "of your accomplishments and your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I saw it with my own eyes. Not even the half of what had been told me is true. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass anything that I have heard." So King Solomon excelled all the kings in riches and in wisdom. And the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, because he was first and foremost centered in God. You know, the Bible figure of Solomon is often held up for us as a model of wisdom. He was born into a royal household in Israel, presumably given the best education that one could have at the time. He was vested with power at a very young age and became seasoned in the art of political diplomacy in his 20s. He also commanded a substantial army and was very good at warfare. Reportedly, he was very handsome, and as tradition had, he had 1,000 wives. Tradition credits him with the erotic poem on sensuality and love that is in the Song of Solomon. My students at Rutgers University always used to be amazed that this was actually in the Bible. Presumably, he was very successful in the art of love. Reportedly, he traded in rare and beautiful gifts to his neighbors, so we can presume that he had great taste and had the means to surround himself with things that are precious and aesthetic. He also built the first great temple in Jerusalem, expanded the city walls so that they encompass more or less what they are today, and he put up a huge royal complex that defined Jerusalem as a leading capital in the ancient world. And the stories told about him in midlife, the two women came to him with a dispute over a baby. Both of them claimed that the baby was theirs. And after hearing the impassioned pleas of both of these women, Solomon called for the baby to be cut in half, and each half was to be given to the mother. And right at that moment, the real mother renounced her claim to the child and offered the child to the other woman. It's a story that's remembered about Solomon to illustrate his moral and psychological insight into human nature. He was an accomplished man. He was a model of success. And yet in his mature years, he's reported to have written the book of Ecclesiastes as well, which is also traditionally associated with him. And in Ecclesiastes, the writer says over and over, surveying the delight of sensuality and remembering the headiness of exercising power, even the contentment of moral integrity and the beauty of precious gold, he says this: vanity, vanity, all is vanity. It's an interesting observation coming from someone who had experienced so much success in his life, someone who had drunk so deeply from all the good things that life has to offer. And the observation about the vanity of things need not end in cynicism or despair. Let me hasten to add, one summer, I had a moment like this, packed densely, what Solomon was trying to describe poetically. It was the end of the day, and I was standing on a sheer cliff. It fell several hundred feet down to the North Sea. I was in the northernmost part of Scotland on the island of Orkney. The wind was blowing probably 20, 40 miles an hour. It was a very cold wind. The waves crashing at the base of the cliff were probably 20 or 30 feet high, an enormous amount of power that you could feel in the ground itself as I stood there. I'd hiked a couple miles to get up to this point, and I'm standing up there. There's no one around, and I'm looking out what looks to be the end of the earth. And I stood there just absorbing all of the wind and the energy of the sea. The sun was going down in the west, and the moon was coming up in the east. It was an incredibly combined kind of encounter with nature, and I felt so far away from my home and alone. And in the space of literally what was probably only a long minute, I reflected on the age of the universe, 15 billion years, and the changes that had gone on around me to create these seas and these cliffs. And at the same time, I was reflecting on the age of civilization. I just happened to be standing where the oldest site we have of civilization in Europe is about 3500 BC, so most of what we know is from the last 5,000 years. And I was thinking how even great writers like Geoffrey Chaucer or Shakespeare only lived through their work a few centuries, and how even the greatest buildings of Rome last only about 1,000 years, and how the vast majority of us just have a few decades here on earth. And I was filled in that moment with this, what Jean-Paul Sartre used to call the existential loneliness of human existence. I could suddenly feel in my soul the fact that we're born alone, that we make this journey from life to death, surrounded by other people, it is true, but even great relationships come to an end, and nothing lasts forever. And I could just feel the transitory nature of my life, the evanescence of human existence. These are moments that drove Sartre to despair because he had no faith in God. And it's a moment of sadness, to be sure, but it doesn't have to be a moment of despairing. And in that second, I just wanted to know. I just suddenly, inside my heart, really wanted to know, why are we here? What is the purpose of our life, really? And I asked myself, and this is really the question that we do, are you really living? It's a short ride. Are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? It's so easy to get sidetracked by our anxieties and sidelined by our desires. And it's a good question to raise internally. Are we fulfilling our purpose? Are we becoming authentic? And I tried to share this with my wife later in the day. I think she was chopping carrots and never looked up after I finished the story. She said, "Honey, you didn't eat any of those mushrooms on your way up to the cliffs, did you?" And she said, "Honey, you're just getting older and you're feeling the passing of time differently. It's normal." And that's right, of course. Aristotle said you have to be a certain age before you can begin the process of reflection on the world that leads to a kind of wisdom. He said you have to be a good citizen. You should be involved in the life of your community. You should build up the programs for the next generation. You need to have lived through war and how horrible it really is. You need to have engaged yourself in personal failure. You need to develop certain habits and disciplines in your life so that you have some strength of character in some areas. You need to understand the possibilities, but also the limits of human character. And then he said there comes a time in your life, he thought it was around 50, when you should retire, because a good life in ancient Athens, you only lived to be 60. But it's at that age, he said, that we ought to retire from running everything in the world and begin thinking on matters eternal. The culmination of this process is putting together the bigger picture and becoming wise so that we can pass on that wisdom to the next generation. The journey to wisdom, quite obviously, begins earlier than that. Socrates used to say the unexamined life is not worth living. And what he meant by that is that we should reflect periodically on what we're doing and how we sustain ourselves throughout our life. All around the ancient Near East, you'd find similar injunctions. They were on a pillar or a post. It was in bas relief usually, and it was a skull and crossbones. And underneath it was written, "Know thyself." What that meant is know that you're mortal. Remember that you're mortal. See your life in terms of your death, and make sure that you're living a meaningful life even now. Make sure you're actualizing your mission statement and developing authenticity. And for those of us who are shaped by biblical faith, A large part of that is remembering who we are. Elie Wiesel used to say that you could sum up the entire of the Old Testament in just one word: remember. That's really why we come together every week, to remember who we are and where we are headed. What a powerful thing remembering can be. I remember when I was in college, backpacking around Europe, I met another guy my age studying at Columbia University. We were in Germany at the time, and both of us happened to be visiting a concentration camp, one that was still opened after World War II. He was very moved by the experience. Of course, it was one of those days both of us took in silence. Later that night, he was still quite pensive. We were drinking beer, and I asked him what he was reflecting on. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said to me, "I realized that I'm a Jew." His name was something like Weinstein. I'm thinking to myself, you're just now figuring this out. But he was having that deeper kind of remembering Elie Wiesel is talking about, the kind of remembering that changes the direction you take in the future. We parted ways, but I saw him again later in the summer. It was at the very end. It was a Friday afternoon. We were coming up to Jerusalem at the beginning of Shabbat. There were hundreds of people that were coming into the Wailing Wall. They were all dancing around as they do in the Old City to begin the prayers and remember the covenant that God made with Israel and worship together. And I saw him in the midst of this throng of people. He had been coming from Europe, and I had come from Egypt to get there. And he says to me, "I'm staying. This is where I belong. I'm transferring. I'm coming back to my home." And again, I'm thinking, quit your future, overcrowded, overtaxed, militaristic castle that Israel is. It's an interesting place to visit, but wow, change your life? But there's something beguiling about remembering who you are and really knowing it and really living out of that. That has a spiritual power to change the direction and set us off in a new path. And of course, that path doesn't stay fixed, does it? Life's a lot more complicated than that. I haven't heard from him now in 40 years. And I wonder what he's doing now. I wonder if a couple of years ago he didn't wake up and remember, you know what? I'm an American. Decide he's going to get the hell out of the nightmare that Israel has become, because nothing stays fixed. Remembering is an active, ongoing process. It's an adventure that takes us to new places that we've never been before. St. Augustine used to say that what we need to do is think after God. In the Bible, God has given us a direction to think after. God delivered us from oppression and bondage in Egypt, made a covenant with the people of Israel, gave them the 10 Commandments, and established a structure for living with one another, with our spouses, our relatives, and our neighbors near and far. The purpose that God has for our lives is not something that's abstract and unknowable. It's also very personal and intimate. It's been revealed to us. The prophet Isaiah, speaking of the Messiah, said, "The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding, and his delight shall be in the awe before God. He shall judge with righteousness for the poor and decide for the least of these among us." So think after God for wisdom, and think after Jesus as well. The wonderful introduction to the Gospel of John begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth." St. Augustine said, if you want to know what God wants for your life, think after the Christ, in whom we can see God's will for us reflected in authentic humanity. Wisdom's not just an abstract speculation. It's also, indeed, primarily an intimate reflection on how do we live well. And it's interesting that in the Bible, when you do this, you attain Sophia. That's the word for wisdom, Sophia. It's a feminine word. The word Sophia sometimes is used for the name of God. It kind of introduces a little gender polarity into the divine being, a kind of yin to the yang, because the rest of the images in the Bible are overwhelmingly male. There are other times that Sophia is used as a synonym for the life of the Spirit, living out of the way that we can through the Christ. And of course, speculation on the meaning of this is voluminous. I only want to highlight the obvious, the very important leadership of mature, wise women in our lives. Because most of our models for wisdom implicitly are patterned after some mature, wise woman that we have known. There's something about having lived through youth and young adulthood, birthing and raising the next generation, and nurturing and cajoling and pushing them into independence, and understanding the changes that take place in different stages of our life, and getting a handle on relationships, and dealing with disappointment and tragedy, and understanding the vulnerability of making a huge investment in other people before you know it's actually going to pay off. There's something about starting to raise your children as children and understanding what actually lasts and what's important about living and what people need to flourish. All of these spiritual issues wise women know makes for rich living. They have a special kind of knowledge. They know it not just here, but actually down here because they have lived it. In graduate school, we had to translate letters from kids in college writing back home to Rome. Young adults on their first big positions in Egypt or in college at Egypt. And I was struck by the pattern that all of these letters had. Regularly, they would ask Dad about the political life in Rome and what was going on in the capital, and then they would make a not-so-subtle plea for a little money from the bank of Dad. My chariot is broken. I need a new horse. And then to Mom, they would pour out all the concerns of their heart, how to mend a relationship they'd botched up, how to compromise with their spouse without looking like they'd given in, how to deal with all the daily issues, the concrete spiritual issues that give our lives meaning. And I asked our Latin professor about it, and he said, well, then as now. We've always needed the leadership of mature women. It's one of the main reasons that the church is vital today, because we've always had it. And it's such a vital time for growth, for passing on to the next generation. When my wife heard I was preaching on wisdom, she commented, "Dear, this should be one of your shorter sermons." And so it shall. Think and reflect on the big picture and find your place in it. Return your focus to why you're here and what you're supposed to be about. Learn from the elders. Pass it on. Amen.